Hello and welcome to Ye Olde Guide, your podcast guide to the history of the towns and cities of England. I'm Liam McGrath and I'm delighted to introduce once again historian Daniel Gooch. Daniel and I have been travelling the country, exploring the towns and cities of England and delving into their hidden histories as well as the well-known stuff. We've visited some popular towns and we've visited some less well-known towns as well. So do check out all our episodes and maybe try some of the less popular places. I don't know, Wakefield, Warrington, Swindon, Stoke-on-Trent. They've all got fascinating histories as uncovered by the podcast. So do check them out on our website, yeoldeguide.com. But this episode is the second part of our history of Tudor and Stuart towns as part of our wider series on how settlements have developed over time in the UK. Last time we spoke about the background of the Tudor and Stuart era. We spoke about the political upheaval of the Reformation, the English Civil War, and we spoke about how dangerous towns were, whether it was plagues or fires. What a difficult era it was to live in. But now it's time to learn more about what these places really felt like. Imagine this. We're going back to the Stuart era, let's say, and I'm wearing my Stuart era garb, maybe a Dutch-style suit, ribbon, leather boots and gloves. I'm coming to town, a Stuart town. I suppose the first question, Daniel, is, well, how on earth would I get to this town?
Well, travel between urban areas was still difficult. The first canals were yet to be developed. You really just had rivers, some of which were made navigable or very old roads. There was one small but significant development in the 17th century, in your Stuart era, which was the early development of turnpike roads. Now, turnpike roads were roads maintained by trusts set up by parliamentary acts. And the turnpike was really just a kind of gate or barrier, and the roads were set up with these gates containing toll booths where you'd have to pay to use the road, a bit like an early form of the tolls you get on some quicker motorways today. But you could do that to use the quicker, more convenient, better maintained route. Now, the first of these turnpike trusts was established in 1663, and the route of this is still preserved today in Cambridgeshire. But it was slow going at first for the development of these. There were only 7 turnpike trusts established by 1700, well short of the peak of around 1,000 in the 1830s. So while they did exist, good road options were quite limited in this era.
Limited and not particularly fast, but we've got some turnpikes, I suppose. And so I'm taking the turnpike into my Stuart town, and what's the first thing I see as I approach the town?
Well, yeah, it does depend on the area you're coming in. But in Tudor town, the skyline wouldn't have changed very much from the Middle Ages. The first and largest buildings you'd notice would still be churches. They're in all towns, and some cities had many, but fewer were being built later in this period after the dissolution of the monasteries. Now, London is the big exception following the Great Fire of London. So if you're entering Stuart London, you would have seen more kind of neoclassical designs of churches, many built by Christopher Wren. Though unfortunately, many of them have been demolished or destroyed in the Blitz since then. Only 16 of the 50-odd he built remain in London. But that's what you might expect to see from a distance in many places.
So you'd see the skyline,
cathedrals,
church tower or spire. Yep. Probably depending on where you are in the country, a slightly different architectural style. This completely different situation in London because of the exceptional fire that we spoke about in the last episode. Something we often talk about in our episodes, Daniel, is town walls. To what extent would town walls be part of what we'd see at this stage in history?
Okay, so yeah, as you're approaching the town, if you're approaching in Tudor times, many Tudor towns did still have their medieval walls. Over 100 English towns had some kind of urban defences by the end of the Middle Ages. New castles at this time were noted to be especially strong and magnificent. But it's fair to say that these fortifications weren't ubiquitous. There were plenty of significant towns, like Reading as one example, that didn't have any kind of defences until perhaps rudimentary ones were put up quickly during the Civil War later on. And when they did exist, they were often no longer needed and were in many cases falling into disrepair. But there was a little construction work done first by the Tudors. Berwick is one notable exception of a walled city that underwent post-medieval construction work, and we spoke extensively about that in our special on England's best walled cities.
Great walls in Berwick, absolutely fantastic.
Definitely.
Any other examples of walls in this period?
Yeah, there was some 16th century defensive work at Southwold and at Tilbury. This is all now gone. A few existing coastal defences were upgraded, like in Portsmouth and Great Yarmouth. But later on, some of the existing walls were, as you'd expect, used and in some cases upgraded during the Civil War. Though also, on the other side of the coin, many were actually deliberately destroyed as a legacy of the Civil War because authorities didn't want towns to have this kind of way of keeping of the authorities out, or in some cases just as revenge for being on the wrong side of the war. I think in Coventry's case, it was Charles II after the Restoration who had them destroyed. But while many may have been in a poor condition and, as we said, deliberately slighted or destroyed after the Civil War for military reasons or political reasons, no one was deliberately clearing them away and knocking them down yet purely for aesthetic or town improvement reasons. That came later. So you did have a big array of kind of some newer ones, but in many cases, the older medieval ones, more dilapidated state.
Great. So they're not being swept away just yet. So we've come towards the town, possibly by turnpike. We've possibly come past a recently improved town wall, or maybe one that's somewhat more dilapidated, maybe through a gate. Once we'd entered the town, what was the street layout like?
In most cases, still medieval. There was still lots of open space, particularly in Tudor towns. Norwich, for instance, one of the largest cities in the country, but still noted as being full of orchards. Mick Aston has noted that nearly a third of the space within Exeter's city walls wasn't built on as late as 1523. The layout of the towns or cities would also include many long, thin burgage plots of the type we described in part one, running between the different streets within the town. The roads you'd actually walk on as part of this layout wouldn't be pleasant. They were still mostly not paved in Tudor England. Some roads might have gravel laid, but even by Stuart times, many cities and towns still had their narrow, muddy streets filled with waste from animals roaming around or going to fairs. There was one exception in Windsor, among others. Windsor was an exception and had some paving in the 1580s, but usually property owners were expected to maintain the area on streets outside their buildings. There was some regulation, though, aimed at keeping the streets clean to a basic level. For instance, in Maidstone, they had rules to stop householders sweeping poo into the gutters, where it might run into the river, and also in other towns, there might be requirements to sweep rubbish outside your house for scavengers to pick up and for animals to be kept from the streets. Really, though, towns didn't start to move away from this base template of kind of medieval mud and filth until the 18th century. However, the use of these roads and the streets within towns had moved on a bit. There was a bit more traffic in this time than in the Middle Ages. The sedan chair was a late Tudor introduction. You had horse-drawn coaches start to come along in Stuart times with wider networks and organised services really taking off a bit after the Restoration. Some towns had specially adapted travel facilities like Yarmouth, which had narrow coaches to fit its narrow streets. So there was a bit more going on in these roads, even if you are still looking at that template of medieval filth in many cases.
The template is still these winding medieval streets, and you can still find those kind of streets in some of our towns, which is wonderful to see. But these are really constrained streets. When did we start getting any more sort of formal planning to improve these streets?
Well, if you're talking about kind of widespread urban planning, then not too much in this time. That was really more a feature of Georgian and Regency towns. And there is one standout exception to that, and kind of exception to this organic medieval chaos in the squares and piazzas that we started to see in West London. While we had seen, as we've mentioned in our last special in this series, some planned towns under the Normans, squares and piazzas were a completely new style of planning and brought a very different aesthetic from this kind of functionalism of Norman planning. They were imported from Italy, where you had Renaissance architecture building on inspirations of Roman forums, and led to the first piazza in Covent Garden in the 1630s. This looked very different then from how it looks now. It was originally a fashionable residential area, but later became a poorer area and a market, with all the original terraces now gone. And then later, housing squares followed further west in London, particularly after the Civil War in the 1660s. Bloomsbury Square and St James's Square popped up in this time. Very often these squares were built on fields of land, patches owned and plots owned by dukes and earls who hoped to make money from their designs, and would often include townhouses for themselves in the designs. But as I said, London was very much the exception to the rule. It was pretty much the only part of the country showing any proper planning of this nature at the time.
But this is quite significant because those squares will go on to be a defining feature of the next era that we study, for which they're known. But it's interesting to know that they've started to be seen in the west side of, we now call it central London, sort of Covent Garden area, much earlier perhaps than we think when we go to those places, and perhaps associate places like Covent Garden, St James's Square, Soho Square. You think they're a bit later, you sort of assume they're going to be Georgian, but it turns out they're a bit earlier. So that's quite an interesting lesson for me, but very much limited to London at this stage.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is interesting. Okay, well, so we've got an idea of what the towns were like. Not a huge amount of progress I'm sensing really in the sort of streets and layout, maybe a bit more congested. What else would you encounter in the towns of this era? What do people look like? What's the sort of social groupings like in the towns?
In social groupings, generally, wealthier citizens would live in the centre of towns. The poorest tended to live where they could, perhaps tucked away behind the streets and the housing we spoke about last time, or on the outskirts of the towns. But towards the end of this period, more and more of the real elite, the aristocracy, were starting to kind of expand away from their country estates and buy houses in towns, buy their townhouses, as they call them. This may explain to an extent some of the improvements in towns in this period, the elite demanding better utilities and more entertainment.
Yeah, what kind of thing would they have been looking for?
Okay, so water supplies were one thing that got a lot better in some locations. A classic arrangement before this era was that water bearers would simply bring water to people's houses and sell it to people. But then large towns started introducing piping systems to bring water to public pipes where you could fill your bucket. And the conditions still weren't great by modern standards. They were often constructed with poor quality pipe work and had long queues. People might wash at the pipe to avoid the hassle of bringing all the water back home, which would only add to your frustrating wait. But you would have these kind of conduits, these taps, bringing your water to certain locations where people could get it. There were even some water-powered pumping systems to bring river water, which wasn't drinkable, into houses themselves, though these were limited strictly to wealthy homes. So it definitely wasn't a commonplace thing to have piped water into your homes then.
And had there been much immigration from outside the country at this point?
There had been some. While the vast majority of people were English, there was some migrant presence, about 50,000 it's been estimated during Elizabeth I's reign alone. Many came from the Netherlands. You had a combination of religious refugees, particularly from Catholic Spanish authorities in the Netherlands, and migrants with economic motives. But while they were relatively small in number, they had greater relative numbers and impacts in towns, because migrants were particularly concentrated in urban areas, especially London and other towns across the southeast of England.
Yeah, you can imagine those would have been the places that were the easiest and most accessible. So I'm trying to get a sense of what was going on in these towns, like the hustle and bustle, the kind of the culture, or even the civic life. What was going on in these towns at this time?
So I suppose in the collective civic life of towns, there was a long-term but not complete, but quite notable decline in kind of religious-led pageantry associated really with the dissolution of the monasteries and the Reformation. But you had more municipal displays, mayoral processions, opening of assizes, that kind of thing. Plus you still had secular civic traditions like bull running and parish feasts in some towns. If you think about cultural buildings that you might see, these were mainly churches at the beginning of this period, but more diverse types started to be added. We went into some of the reasons for that in part one, but you had schools, public walks, almshouses, added by both private individuals and public bodies. And while you had fewer Church of England churches being built, from 1689, this was the first time that dissenting, i.e. non-Church of England Protestants, could build their own places of worship. Celia Fiennes counted 4 of these in Bury St Edmunds as early as the 1690s. And unfortunately, this courtesy didn't stretch to Catholics, who had to wait some time for anything approaching equality of toleration for their worship. And for schools, you had petty schools for children up to the age of 8, for basic skills for a fee. Some towns had grammar schools for older age groups. These were starting to pick up a bit more in this era.
Starting to get these civic buildings. And what about entertainment?
I suppose beyond these civic events, you had a great demand, particularly towards the later 17th century, for entertainment. As towns became more fashionable, this was probably linked to an extent with the arrival of the aristocracy, which we mentioned earlier. Inns might start to include bowling greens, balls, and concerts. Taverns were sometimes just open halls and occasionally combined with brothels, a form of entertainment, I suppose, in that era. There was one very important development, the first purpose-built theatre in England, built in Shoreditch in 1576. It was simply called The Theatre, but it was built 2 decades before the more famous Globe in Southwark. But London, once again, was the outlying trendsetter here, as purpose-built theatres didn't really spread outside the capital until the 18th century. There was another important first in Oxford, the first museum in the country, the Ashmolean, which opened in 1683. Once again, though, a kind of an outline trendsetter, and really no other museums came along until the 18th century. You also had a few examples of early public walks, Pall Mall in London, the Abbey Gardens in Shrewsbury among them. And while none of these firsts took off to a massive extent at this time, they do at least sow the seeds of what came later under the Georgians, early versions of assembly rooms, theatres, public walks, and other cultural amenities we associate with later times in leisure towns.
Now, that all sounds very nice. We all like the theatre and a nice walk along the Mall and such things. But what about ordinary people? What would they have done?
Well, as some of the things we might recognise today, you had markets, shopping, taverns, theatres, but also people had pastimes totally alien to us, blood sports in particular, which were often associated with gambling, hence why the Puritans disliked them so much. You might get cockfighting on Sundays, and those fights could be vicious. Owners would sometimes get their animals drunk first to wind them up more. Bear baiting as well. Bear baiting might be on in theatres where you pay for entry to watch it. You get dogs let loose one at a time or in packs to attack a bear whose teeth will be blunted. And dog after dog will be brought in until the bear was exhausted, though usually the bear wasn't killed because, as you probably imagine, an imported bear was quite valuable. They didn't want them dying every time. But you could get dozens of dogs and multiple bears in the largest theatres. As you can imagine, witnesses say these places absolutely stank. And very occasionally you'd get a bear that would escape and sometimes kill people. So they'd occasionally get their revenge.
Good grief.
And speaking of smells and bad habits, I suppose we should also mention that tobacco was introduced into England in the 1560s. It became very popular, smoked heavily in taverns, and later James I became one of the most prominent and early anti-smoking campaigners, though clearly it wasn't that influential in the long run. It took a good 400 years before people started listening to him.
Yeah, well, who knows? It might have gone by the 2060s for all we know. 500 years.
Yeah, we get grandfathered in with smoking rights, don't we?
That's right.
We'll be selling them to 55-year-olds when we're 60.
I find the bear baiting absolutely extraordinary. But there you go. You always something extraordinary on this podcast. Let's go back to the buildings then. Get back to the core of the podcast: buildings, layouts, towns, architecture. Just a sense of what these buildings were like. What was the building material? What did they look like?
Tudor times, you were still mainly building in wood, usually oak, though sometimes elm was used in the 15th and 16th centuries because it's cheaper. In many towns, the only stone buildings were churches, though there were some exceptions, like some towns in Northamptonshire, I think in the Cotswolds, where you might have local stone that could be used for building. Brick was important. Brick had been around for a few centuries, but it started to be used a bit more in Tudor times. One early example is in the town gate in Beverley. It only became more popular than wood, overtook that as a popularity in the 18th century, but it did become more common later in this era, and it started to be seen as kind of the hallmark of a successful and modern town. Brick kind of gave your town some status.
Yeah, that makes sense. What's this? What then is the Great Rebuilding? Is that a feature of this period in time?
Yeah, the Great Rebuilding definitely is. It's an academic theory some listeners might have come across, which really suggests this kind of radical and connected revolution in building construction, particularly in housing, in late Tudor and Stuart times, not just in towns across the country, but of course of equal relevance to towns, and at different times in different regions. Now, the theory was the brainchild of W.G. Hoskins, who was a highly influential local historian, who personally said that the Great Rebuilding peaked from about 1575 to 1625 before the Civil War, but lasted in some regions until the 18th century, so a really broad scale of time, depending on where you're looking at.
Is there any particular reason why it was that period?
There are a few ideas, a few theories, as well as greater economic prosperity. Colin Platter suggested that you had an increasing population, which led to more people, more entrepreneurship in trades. So you had more kind of production of household furnishings to improve buildings. As Ian Mortimer puts it, there are changes not just in how much money people have, but in what the money can get you. We should also look at the fact there was more land to build on following the dissolution of the monasteries, possibly greater stability after years of internal political turbulence after the Civil War and the threat of invasion. William Harrison in 1577 noted how many old houses were being demolished and rebuilt. Hoskins himself theorised this kind of circular effect of rebuilding and, to better standards, increasing population. You could have bigger families and better homes, which itself led to more people to do the rebuilding, a kind of virtuous circle in that respect.
What do you think? Because I can see different arguments here. Do you think it's a thing? Do you think there was more going on in that particular window, more reconstruction?
There definitely was a lot more rebuilding this period. The theory that there was some kind of interconnected revolution has been challenged. I suppose, speaking subjectively, it might be a little difficult to buy into the whole thing in that respect. It's an interconnected theory. If you think about the breadth of time it supposedly covers, it's hugely varied timings and the experiences of rebuilding at this time, plus the fact there was so little centralised or broader planning revolution, almost makes it seem as much a series of events that happened as a single overarching phenomenon, especially when no one's come up with one unifying idea that's solid as to what caused it. Eric Wood has also added the view that better living conditions led to lower infant mortality, so more population, which led to higher urban populations, more overcrowding, and therefore lower social benefits. So effectively, any social benefits of the Great Rebuilding were lost through urban population increases and poorer quality of life. But still, there's no denying the overall trajectory was one of transformation from timber framing and vernacular styles to brick and classical designs from the end of the 17th century, later into the 18th century, and our towns were definitely starting to look different by the end.
Well, it's good to know what the Great Rebuilding is. It's something you hear referenced quite a bit. I mean, you've spoken about the change from timber to starting to get into brick, and that obviously that's quite a significant change. What other sort of changes were made to houses, let's say?
Yeah, and the Great Rebuilding is especially of note to housing, really. And the houses were not necessarily completely rebuilt. They didn't necessarily knock them down and start again, but they might be modernised, expanded, better equipped and better furnished. Eric Wood gives examples of ceilings and staircases being added to produce upper floors, partition of rooms, more windows and fireplaces, porches, windows and better furniture, which you can imagine would greatly improve people's quality of life rather than just living in one big hall together. For the poor, things like windows and proper chimneys started to replace holes in the walls and in the middle of the roof. Windows, we should talk a bit about them in particular. They only started to be glazed in the late 16th century for wealthier urban residents from about the 1570s and a few centuries early for the very richest. But glazing, having glass in your windows, was still a status symbol and far from ubiquitous even in the 17th century. You'd still in many cases get shutters with grills made of a variety of materials, wood, bone, stone, metal, to cover the open holes and keep the winds out. Chimneys were almost never seen in small houses before the 16th century, but started to be seen more later. The introduction of chimneys might sound trivial, but it did completely change the layout of poorer houses. It meant you could have multiple heated rooms, each with their own fireplace, not just one single big heated hall around a hearth. The new use of brick would help with this as well, because this was more heat resistant than stone. So you might get big brick chimneys built from the floor up inside houses that might still be timber. Brick chimneys in wealthy homes later became very ornate. Bricks might be moulded or carved into patterns. You also got more ornate brickwork in places on the chimney tops. If you have Hampton Court's got some great ornate brick chimneys there, very famous. You'll see them in other places. In most cases, they are Victorian imitations, but at least it was a kind of new kind of furnishing to houses associated with these improvements.
Yeah, I mean, those are beautiful. And Hampton Court has got some beautiful features. What other kind of features would people put on their homes?
There was a lot of variations you could imagine between the wealthiest houses and the poorest houses. Wealthy houses would often have ostentatious shows of wealth in carvings, windows, coats of arms and signs, plus elaborate furniture and furnishings. The very largest wealthy houses in towns might be built around courtyards of multiple floors, even with their own gatehouses. You might even have had animals within the courtyards, including perhaps turkeys introduced from the Americas in the 1520s. Oriel windows became common from the late 1500s. Oriel windows are windows that project out from a top floor. If you search for a picture on the internet, you'll know instantly what I mean. The Grade 1 listed ancient house in Ipswich, one of the best surviving examples in the country of a wealthy Stuart house, has some of the best early examples of these Oriel windows. And houses started to include porches from the late 16th century. Sometimes you'd have even a room above the porch. So that's wealthy houses. Middle earners might still have fairly comfortable housing. As Ian Mortimer wrote, if you're working in a town, you are likely to be working in a concentrated area, the shop or house you lived in, so you would concentrate your wealth in that building. Unlike people who are living and working rurally, who had to invest in farms, fields and outbuildings in the town, everything goes into your one building, your workshop, your place of work, your place of habitation. There was a lot of variation in what these middle-earning houses might have looked like, but a typical example can be seen in a survey of a weaver's house in Ipswich in 1615. It contains a hall containing table and chairs, a fireplace and various other furnishings, a buttery and a parlour next to the hall with cupboards and 2 beds, another buttery for storing beer, a brew house, 2 workshops, and a yard, so plenty of rooms in this house. The workshops contained his weaving equipment, and the yard a few animals. You've again got this kind of symbiosis of your living space and your working space. A few other chambers too, used for storing food and clothes. Now that's the middle earners' houses. The poorest houses, really just slums. They were slum housing, terrible housing wasn't just an invention of industrial England. Bedding would usually be canvas with no pillow. Maybe one family to a room in houses shared with multiple families, no peace from your neighbours. People had minimal possessions, perhaps meagre bedding and a bowl. It wasn't a happy existence.
No, miserable. But at least the middle earners got to have a buttery dedicated to beer.
If there's one thing I've learned, if you ever want to be a time traveller and go back to the past, be rich. It's very important. Great advice for anyone, really.
No doubt at all. But I'd settle for middle income if I get a beer buttery. And that sounds great to me. What about the architectural style of them? You've spoken about the detail and sort of the luxuries, perhaps. What was the style they built in?
Well, up to kind of the Civil War, about 1640, local, distinctive and vernacular architecture was more common. But getting later towards 1700, you had more rebuilding starting to be done in kind of more uniform neoclassical styles that we associate with the Georgian era. This kind of regularity, uniformity of styles was starting to replace the kind of local distinctive vernacular styles. If you think of late Stuart and Georgian London after the fire, replacing the wooden, jettied, crowded streets of the pre-fire city, you'll have some idea of what I'm getting at. The first fully classical building was the banqueting house in London by Inigo Jones, who designed Covent Garden at the same time. But as we said, still not much kind of classical planning yet outside London. If you think about specific architectural features and characteristics, new Stuart houses could be bigger with, as we said before, more use of brick. We began to get Dutch gables in southeast England in the 1600s. A gable is the triangular end you'd get on a roof, and a Dutch gable is one where each side leading up to the point is composed of steps, kind of square steps, rather than just a straight line of tiles, which is more common. Terraced houses, not an entirely new concept, but they started becoming more popular from the 1670s. The advantages of these are pretty obvious. They were cheaper and a more efficient use of space as towns started to get busier. Once again, it started in London with rebuilding after the Great Fire and increasing population from migration, requiring more efficient housing options.
So you said earlier we're starting to get more variety in civic buildings. Do you say a bit more about the kind of civic buildings we'd be seeing in towns in this era?
Yeah, I suppose we could talk about kind of civic political buildings. You had new shire halls and town halls in many towns in this period. These were used for administrative purposes by local government, but could also include leisure spaces like assembly rooms and even shops. There were also town halls in many towns. The main difference was that shire halls were used by justices of the peace, whereas town halls were used in towns which were exempt from county justice jurisdiction. Town halls had already existed in most places, often thatched and built with timber frames, but lots were rebuilt at this time from brick and stone. Nottingham had two, one each for the French and English boroughs. We mentioned in our Nottingham episode these two parallel towns that grew up alongside each other. The one ancient Saxon English borough and the new Norman French borough next to it around the castle.
And were there shops?
Yes, at the beginning of this period, you still mainly had just medieval markets and fairs, with marketplaces. They were still a dominant part of any town in the way we described in our medieval cities episode. But by the 1600s, you started to get more proper permanent shops in towns, as well as more trade in fixed establishments like inns. There were more and more glass-fronted shops by the end of this period. They started to move away from being glorified permanent market stalls into something we would recognise today as shops. So a really important development there in the way we think of towns and their purposes today.
That is a big change, going from market stalls to something like looking like a shop. Okay, well, I think I've got a good sense here of the transformation of towns over this era and the movement towards brick, the improvement of housing, the introduction of shops. That feels like quite a big change to me. Is there anywhere in particular that you'd pick out for trying to see some of these features? Is there anywhere today where we could go and see them?
Yeah, I suppose if we're looking at recommendations, what I'd like to pick out are towns where not necessarily you have individual good examples of buildings or anything like that. Like we mentioned the ancient house in Ipswich, but it's not on a Tudor or a Stuart street. But there are towns where you can get more of that overall sense around the town of the feel of a Tudor or Stuart town. Lavenham in Suffolk is a wonderful Tudor town. It grew rich from wool like much of East Anglia in the 15th and 16th centuries, and it still retains many of the original timber frame Tudor buildings from that period. Many of these have this kind of charming crooked nature, possibly because they were built using young timber, which twisted as it aged. It still got its large church built from wool trade profits in the 1520s, and it's been used several times in film to represent a kind of Tudor, Stuart, or just a general oldie worldy town. The Vincent Price film Witchfinder General, which was set during the Civil War, was used Lavenham as the filming location to be kind of this general Stuart town. And filming also took place at Kentwell Hall not far away, which puts on fantastic Elizabethan reenactment events every year. If you're looking for a larger city, there are parts of Worcester which are good to go to. It has suffered more subsequent rebuilding, if suffer is the right word, than some smaller places like Lavenham. But it still has areas with good Tudor buildings in New Street and Friar Street. Finally, there are two small towns near each other which are worth mentioning because they show off the distinctions of the local vernacular building styles in this early period, Henley and Arden and Chipping Campden in the Cotswolds. Now, Henley and Arden has lots of your classic Tudor Stuart old timber frame buildings from this period. Chipping Campden is only 20 miles away and has many buildings from the same era, but built in a completely different style, mainly from the local limestone rather than timber. I think that contrast between two towns from the same era that look so different really does show the differences in local styles at this time before you got more regularity later on.
No, that's an absolutely brilliant recommendation. Henley and Arden and Chipping Campden. Go to the Cotswolds. Fantastic. Well, I think we've run out of time, Daniel, but I feel like I've learned a lot here about how towns have developed in this era. What's the main takeaway for you? How would you summarise what's happened in the Tudor and Stuart era in the development of English towns and cities?
I suppose we spoke right at the beginning of part one about how this is kind of a forgotten era in the history of English urban development. But what I hope we've shown is how this really was a critical link between that medieval kind of mud and timber era and the celebrated rebuilt cities of Georgian times in the use of new building materials, the application of new design standards, in coming kind of through periods of conflict towards a later period, towards the end of this era of greater economic and political stability. And as that happened, you had the seed starting to be sown for the emergence of neoclassical planning and grand urban designs, where towns were more the focus of commerce and of leisure than of conflict, more of shops and assembly rooms than of castles and walls. I think that's the real legacy of Tudor and Stuart towns.
Well, it's been another fascinating journey through the history of the development of the towns and cities of England. And I have to say, I'm learning a lot. It's piecing things together very nicely for me. We'll get back to some of our city tours in the next episode, but then we will be resuming this series on how towns are developed, and we'll be going into an era where I think the legacy is much more well known, the Georgian era, which has led to some of the most famous townscapes in the country. So we'll come to that soon in this series. But all our episodes are available on our website, yeoldieguide.com. You can leave comments, questions on there. You can leave a review wherever you find your podcast. We love ratings and reviews. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a lot.